Hundreds of storms cross Britain's landscape every year. Most come and go without notice or comment. But 20 years ago came a storm like no other. A 100 miles away in Edenbridge, a young married couple were about to set out.
I think it was about 12:30ish that I woke John and said, you know, could you ring the hospital and say that we'd better be on our way?
So I rang the hospital up at that point, said we'd be on our way and be with you within the hour.
John and Julie Pell's second child was 3 days overdue. 2 hours earlier, Julie had finally gone into labour.
As we set off down the lanes, the trees had started falling, and there were some branches and some small trees blocking our way. And so John would have to keep stopping the car and jumping out and moving the trees. Sometimes he decided to drive over the tops of them. I was still having contractions all the time as this was going on, and I was sort of hanging onto my seatbelt like this and just hanging on for grim death, really, because he'd actually batter into the tree and then reverse and batter again to get through.
Julie was obviously in a complete state of distress because she wasn't particularly interested or bothered about the wind and the trees coming down. All she was bothered about is actually her comfort, because I think at that point she was in a lot of pain.
Contractions were getting closer together. John understood this urgency and he was desperate to get through at all costs, so anything that it took to get down that road, then that's what we'd do.
We had to get to that hospital because I think, you know, I had back in my mind sort of delivering the baby or doing something in the car, or, you know, and I didn't really want to do that.
All of a sudden there was a scraping noise on the roof of the car. And I shouted, "What's that, what's that?" And John looked round and he said, "Oh, it's just a cable, it's all right." And he was just trying to play it down the whole time.
The cables were making quite a thud noise. They were not only banging on the roof, but they were sort of swaying and sort of hitting the side of the car. I just drove on.
Just a few yards ahead of us, a huge oak tree blocked the road entirely.
I think that was the big decision-making tree that said we're not going to get past that.
We'd noticed a light on in the phone box a little way back, so that's when we turned back to go to that. And we thought we'd have to ring the hospital and tell them that we weren't going to get through.
So I rang the hospital, got through to the department and said there's actually no way we were going to get there. We had a bit of a discussion and I said, well, can't you get a helicopter or something out? And at that point, the telephone cable came down. Hello. So we never finished that conversation. So then panic started again, thinking that we're on our own again now.
Fallen trees had left them stranded 10 miles from the hospital, unable to drive forwards or backwards. Their only option was to turn back home. And this time, they would have to travel on foot.
I didn't want to start walking because I felt that would encourage the baby to be on its way, and I felt that as soon as I started moving about, it'll speed things along too much. I didn't want it to happen that quickly. So I wasn't very keen, but it had to be done. When I had a contraction, I'd stand still and ride it out, and John would run ahead, look at the next obstacle that we had to get over. I was very aware then that the wind was buffeting me and making me move when I didn't want to, which was quite painful. That was just like having a nightmare, one of those nightmares where you're trying to get away from danger and you just can't move. Oh, my waters broke when I was halfway climbing over the trunk of a huge oak tree. That just felt like the worst feeling in the world, really.
I was concerned at that point because, I mean, I suppose being any man with waters breaking, you actually don't know really what that means. And, you know, in the context of the whole pregnancy, you know, it always sounds quite important.
I was really getting into a state then. I got quite a bit hysterical and a bit sort of thinking that we're not going to make it.
I was probably emotional inside rather than externally, but I think Julie was sort of very emotional outside as well, and she started crying and thinking, you know, what the hell's going to happen here?
After 2.5 hours battling through the winds on foot, the dawn finally brought some relief for the Pells.
It was an amazing sight. The wind had actually stopped at that point, and it just went completely silent. And the dawn was just breaking and the sun suddenly appeared. There was nothing moving. There was no lights on any houses because all the power had gone everywhere. And obviously we didn't see anybody.
It was fabulous. It just gave me hope that the storm was now finishing and a new day was starting and there's hope for the future.
John and Julie eventually made it back home. 3 hours later, a baby girl was born, with a little help from a doctor and 2 policemen, who cut their way through fallen trees to the house.
We wanted to call her Andrea, but because of the ordeal of the storm that night, we wanted a name that reflected that as well, so we called her Andrea Gale.